Yes.
Good afternoon, everybody who's joining us from, I assume, many different places. Thank you so much for being patient with us as we dealt with some logistical issues. Drawing together people from 5 different time zones and many different contexts is never an easy task, but here we all are. Thank you so much for this investment of time and trust to join us for this conversation. At Ruta Association, we host webinars like this on a regular basis. Our aim as an association and through these webinars is to put regions that have previously been known by many different names, post-communist, post-Soviet, Eastern Europe, Central Europe, whatever else, on their own terms in conversation with the many other parts of the world that have been called the global south and many other different names. We would encourage you to join us at Ruta as Ruta members, or at least to subscribe to our newsletter and follow us on social media so that you can receive information about more events like this. If you've not signed up, if you've not done so, we would absolutely love to have you. Today's webinar, the pitfalls of campism global perspectives, as I've already mentioned, brings together people from multiple contexts. We are talking about Syria, we are talking about Iran, we're talking about Ukraine, we are talking about Venezuela, and the joint fight for freedom and for understanding that is oftentimes so scarce in the world. This seminar is moderated by our very own Teresa Hendel, who is a philosopher at the University of Augsburg and also a Ruta board member. Teresa, I'm handing this over to you.
Thank you. And thank you for such a great introduction, Grażyna. I'm very honored to open this important conversation as we are glad to have such an incredible lineup of amazing speakers. And I will say that I so wish that we were meeting under much better circumstances. But as this world is such a difficult place right now for so many, it is indeed really crucial to have discussions like this among thinkers and doers from societies who have resisted authoritarian regimes, military occupations, often for generations, as well as challenged many misconceptions that are spread about these struggles globally, from the far right to the left. And so it is my honor to open this webinar. We will have 4 short presentations, and then we will open up the floor for Q&A. So if you have questions, post them in the chat, and please follow the discussion. First, we have a presentation by Rafael Uzcategui, who is a sociologist and human rights advocate. He is currently the co-director of the NGO Laboratorio de Paz, which is Peace Laboratory. From 2006 to 2023, he was part of Provea, one of the best-known NGOs in Venezuela. His latest book, Rebellion Beyond the Left, you can find out and read more in there. And he is currently in exile in Mexico because we are not bilingual enough. His presentation and he wrote a speech in Spanish and was translated into English. Grażyna will read it out. This was meant to be done by Manuel Ferez, who is a friend of Ruta from Chile, but sadly he has an emergency. Manuel is important, though. We need to mention him because he initiates a series of dialogues between Ruta regions and Latin America. And this is one of the starting points, but there is much more to come. So stay tuned. We will have a whole webinar series on dialogues between Ruta and Latin American speakers. So Grażyna will take over this presentation. We're improvising, so bear with us. This is something that comes with organizing globally. We're learning how intense this sometimes is. And we have with us also a wonderful artist, friend of Ruta, Sheila Fernandez, who might be here for translation if Rafael wants to add something or then participate in discussion. So, Grażyna, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Teresa. And you're sharing the slides, right?
I can try. Yes, yes, yes.
Um,
Give me a sec.
Thank you so much, Rafael, for joining us. Gracias por acompañarnos, Rafael. And today I'm going to be your voice. Seré su voz durante la presentación.
Thank you for the invitation. Gracias por la invitación.
Anna, can you give me access to share the slides? I think you can start reading out and we will work this. Okay, I'm host now.
This analysis examines the 2025 transition in Venezuela, arguing that traditional anti-imperialist rhetoric has shifted from an emancipatory discourse to a strategic instrument for elite survival and autocratic consolidation. By analyzing the coordinated transition, quote unquote, facilitated by the Rodriguez faction, this paper posits that the Venezuelan state is pivoting toward a model of quote unquote illiberal capitalism or quote unquote fragmented liberalization, wherein ideological hegemony serves to obscure the internal reconfiguration of power. The contemporary Venezuelan crisis necessitates a critical reevaluation of anti-imperialist frameworks, which have increasingly lost their explanatory power in a multipolar geopolitical landscape. Historically, anti-imperialism in Latin America was defined as a project to reverse structural domination by core powers and to promote sovereignty. However, in the current Venezuelan context, this ideology has been co-opted by state actors to justify the maintenance of authoritarian rule rather than to weaken external hegemony. The recent detention of Nicolás Maduro and the subsequent rise of Delcy Rodriguez suggest that what appeared to be an external, quote unquote, imperialist intervention was in fact a calculated factional realignment within the governing elite. The military operation executed by the Trump administration in the late 2025 against the cartel of the Suns represents a departure from traditional state-to-state warfare, functioning instead as a catalyst for internal regime change. While the international progressive left characterized the strike as a conventional invasion, evidence suggests a negotiated betrayal. Unlike a chess model where moves are transparent, the current transition follows the logic of poker, characterized by hidden hands, strategic bluffs, and alliances between seemingly antagonistic actors. Research into autocratic stability suggests that regimes rest on three pillars: legitimation, repression, and co-optation. The removal of Maduro allowed the civilian political core of Chavismo, represented by the Rodriguez family, to pursue a strategy of co-optation with external powers, thereby securing their own political survival at the expense of the previous leadership. The installation of Delcy Rodriguez as acting president marks a transition toward what scholars have termed fragmented liberalization. This model is not a return to democratic norms, but a strategic adaptation designed to bypass international sanctions through off-the-radar trade and investment flows. Four key indicators support the hypothesis of this coordinated transition. One, tactical non-resistance. The lack of a defensive military response during the Fuerte Tiuna strike, despite the presence of thousands of privileged generals who historically served as the regime's backbone. Number two, executive pragmatism. Trump's explicit preference for Delcy Rodriguez as a viable partner over the traditional opposition suggests a shift towards realism, prioritizing stability and anti-drug cooperation over democratic restoration. Number three, judicial continuity. The Supreme Court's use of temporary absence as a legal pretext allows the regime to maintain a veneer of constitutionalism while avoiding the electoral volatility of a new presidential cycle. And number four, the China model. The emerging governance structure mirrors the Beijing consensus, combining a state-directed market economy with strict political control. This illiberal capitalism challenges the assumption that economic growth and authoritarianism are mutually exclusive. The persistence of binary anti-imperialism, viewing all Venezuelan developments solely through the lens of the US hegemony, serves as a filter that obscures the agency of local elites. By utilizing ideological instruments to maintain dominance, the Rodriguez faction has successfully transformed well-meaning international observers into quote-unquote useful idiots who defend the regime's sovereignty while the elite negotiates the transfer of national rent and property to new international partners. The endogenous hybridity suggests that authoritarianism was inherent in the regime's design, evolving through incremental transitions to foreclose possibilities for democratization. In this context, reflexive anti-imperialism is merely a rhetorical obfuscation that facilitates the expansion of non-Western capitalisms and the consolidation of a new, pragmatic, authoritarian elite. Thus, the Venezuelan case demonstrates that when ideology becomes a tool for power maintenance, it ceases to be a force for liberation. The transition of 2026 represents a pivot toward a more sophisticated, modernized form of authoritarianism that integrates into global markets while suppressing internal dissent. For civil society to regain agency, it must first deconstruct the ideological shield that protects these new forms of domination, recognizing that the hand being played is not one of ideological purity, but of calculated survival. Thank you.
Thank you so much. That was quite a powerful presentation that really shows the co-optation of anti-imperial rhetoric by authoritarian regimes. Second speaker is Ladan Rabare, who is a political sociologist and an associate professor at the Department of Sociology at the University of Amsterdam. She works on gender politics, diaspora politics, social movements, and violence. Ladan, the floor is yours.
Yes, thank you so much for the invitation and for the presentation. Yeah, thank you so much, Rafael, for that powerful speech. It was very, very interesting, and there are quite some parallels between that and some of the things that I will talk about. So I will talk about the context of Iran, and I hope that people attending this webinar have some idea of what is happening, because I can't give a full context on this rather really crazy year that we've had. So first, at the beginning of January 2026, there were mass protests in Iran, and then in February, 28th of February, there was the U.S.-Israeli war on Iran, which of course at the moment is at the moment of ceasefire. In any case, the war is ongoing. So my main argument in this talk will be that both the discourse on protests and the discourse on the US-Israeli war on Iran in the West have been subjected to intentional manipulations, but also misreadings and misrecognitions. And I'm speaking specifically from the perspective of the West. And by that, I don't mean necessarily only Western people, but also diasporic populations. So I want to start by discussing the first type of manipulation that has happened. And that is, in fact, I will start with far right leaning groups. And then slowly I will also talk about what has happened in the left, or a segment of the left. So on 28th of December last year, protests started in Iran, and that slowly escalated into a rather larger scale anti-state movement, which escalated at the beginning of January. The protests were really crushed swiftly, and as it is characteristic of the Iranian state, they cracked down on the protests. They killed a lot of people. They arrested thousands of people. And to talk a little bit about the kind of background of these protests, they were geographically widespread, they were socially diverse, they were politically quite heterogeneous. So really, people who are considered the economic elite, so the bazaar of Tehran. Workers, people who were, tired of precarity, students, ethnic minorities, women, ordinary people. Everybody joined the protests. So there was no single leader, not a very clear unified ideology. There was not central organization going on. It was a movement that at its core, addressed the precariousness of life in Iran at different levels. It was grassroots and spontaneous, as it has been the case for a lot of social movements in Iran in the past decades. So we don't know what percentage of people actually clearly want the kind of regime change that we talk about in the West. But most experts on Iran would agree that this is a rather common sentiment, right? So most people want at least fundamental change in the system, not, just superficial reform. And because this kind of movement, as I was saying, decentralized, plural, leaderless is precisely very difficult to kind of capture in a kind of, party, in a specific leader, or in a kind of bloc, a geopolitical bloc. It is really hard to kind of grasp the complexity of it. Now, this complexity is exacerbated because after the protest movement, there was a larger scale communication blackout in Iran, which dropped the connectivity to close to 0%. So it meant that nobody inside Iran could, contact anybody inside or outside the country, which means that the information that we were getting here in the West was very sparse, very little, and very limited. So what happens in the context of this kind of blackout is that existing factions, political groups outside of the country find a moment to manipulate what comes out for their own political agendas. And the most prominent example of this manipulation was in this case by the far right or right wing faction of the Iranian diaspora, who are the monarchists. So what happens is that the very well-known son of the former dictator of Iran, Reza Pahlavi, came out and kind of claimed responsibility for part of the protests, basically portraying himself as a really important or a kind of leader of a great segment of the protests. And the aftermath of this, what happens in the West is that basically a tremendous amount of media attention in the West was given to this rather unrepresentative movement. Now, let me be precise on this. When I talk about this person, I talk about Reza Pahlavi. He's a real political actor. He has supporters, and there is evidence that some people inside Iran support him. However, there is absolutely no evidence on the size of this group, and we are talking about a moment in which we could not, literally, like practically, technically, we could not hear from the Iranian people. So what happens after that is that much of the coverage of this grassroots, largely leaderless movement, which is pluralistic in its nature, was framed within this kind of idea of being the followers of this specific leader. And of course, this has to do with the way that the media functions. Journalists try to grasp stories, try to reach out to recognizable figures. And in this case, there was a lot of propaganda. There was a PR campaign going on already around the monarchist faction. And of course, he's also very cozy with Israel, and there are reports about Israeli support behind him. So all of this means that in the vacuum that was created, and in a moment where no one, and I mean absolutely no one, could claim to know what Iranians want, a lot of significant attention went towards this faction of Iranians in the diaspora. And because of this, the plurality of the movement basically disappeared. And we got a narrative of succession, we got a narrative of regime change. And through this narrative, the movement itself became basically secondary. Now, you may wonder why all of this matters. You may ask, well, who cares? It's media attention, it fades away. The problem is that most sadly, this dynamic doesn't remain at the level of media attention. It moves to formal politics as well. So through this kind of magnification of the imagery of this person, he has become legitimized in the face of European politics. And I can tell you, in the last week, he has been invited to Sweden, and he has been invited to Italy to talk to hold talks with political institutions, with major parties that are now in power. In both of these countries, openly, but also behind closed doors. Now, I have to say it's very clear that they are from either center-right or far-right factions of politics in these two countries. Now, this was the kind of the reaction that happened in the West after the protests. The second misrecognition or manipulation that I want to talk about is from a segment of the left and their kind of campist response to the protests and the war. So the kind of the media attention around Reza Pahlavi kind of faded a little bit for different reasons. One of the major reasons was that the Israeli-US attack on Iran happened on February 28th, and the killing of 170 schoolgirls on the very first day of the attack. And after that, the media kind of moved on to reportings of the war. Now, I have to say the response of the left to the war has been quite scattered. And I'm not necessarily unhappy with the way that it has received response, but the problem is that there always is the segment of the left which responds to both the protests, but also why the war in campist ways. In relation to the protests, this segment treated it as a kind of suspect movement by saying things like, well, Israel was behind the protests, and this was not a kind of natural organic movement inside Iran, which is the most reductionist and problematic thing that you can say about these protests. Of course, we know almost to a certain, level, Israel has intelligence and terrorist operations inside Iran. This is known. But to make this as the main reading of the, massive people-led movement inside Iran is extremely problematic. And by the way, I was on the streets back in Iran before I left, before 2015. I lived in Iran. I'd been on the streets multiple times. And to us, it doesn't seem like an abstract thing to be on the streets of Iran. There's no need for Israeli meddling for people of Iran to mobilize. And of course, that's something really abstract for some segments of the Western left. And then the war starts, of course, and there is a rightful degree of outrage in the left because, well, frankly, this war is against international law. Not only against it, it makes a fool out of it, the same way that it did in the case of Gaza. And it really does need the kind of attention that it is getting. And of course, it requires that kind of outrage. But then there is also the campist alignment with the Islamic Republic of Iran, with the state. There have been lots of events and protests internationally, also here in the Netherlands, by the way, where I am located, where to the point that I haven't found an event where I can actually go and stand by the other people, because there's always either flags of the Islamic Republic or really problematic slogans aligned with the Iranian state, glorification of the state of Iran as a moral state, or portraits of Iran's now assassinated supreme leader, former supreme leader, who was a bloodthirsty tyrant. This solidarity, this form of solidarity, is of course framed as anti-war, anti-imperialist mobilization, but it is in nature campus politics. So I see this kind of celebration of the Iranian states happening everywhere. And also, by the way, online. So some of you, for those of you who are present on social media, you may have seen these massively viral Lego style videos that an Iranian pro-state group has been releasing. They are satire videos with rap music, making fun of Trump, Netanyahu, and all of that is super rightful, but at the same time also glorifying the Iranian state as the supporter of the global downtrodden, the Palestinians, the Lebanese, even the victims of the Epstein class, and so on. And Iranian states representatives have become sort of, celebrities, representative of the left. And this really, what it does is reproduction and amplification of Iranian propaganda. And Iran has thrown everything that it has at this propaganda for a country that has been so hostile to women, a country that has made it difficult for women to make a living, live a harmonious life, to feel safe and not get violated. Now they are pushing these pictures of women as supporters of state, of the state of Iran, women as soldiers, women as free to wear whatever they want on social media to kind of pinkwash in a way their oppressive and violent ruling. So my main point, to kind of close by giving you these two examples of how campism can work in the left, but also on the right, is that the effect has been very similar. Whether it is the right-wing attention by the monarchists or by the campus left, it does shift the focus away from what matters, the voices of Iranians, which has been completely silenced in both of these stances. The demands of the Iranian people, we still don't know what people want. We have kind of been stuck between narratives of regime change and narratives of the Iranian state as kind of victims of imperialism and those who resist it. And this is, but I have to also say, is a very far cry from the progressive, pluralist, feminist movements that Iran has seen. We saw a massive progressive movement in 2022 in the name of, which was called Women, Life, Freedom, which was a major gain for the civil society Iran. So I also see that kind of, way of working, thinking about resisting, almost vanishing within this very problematic discourse. So to close, I think any kind of solidarity with Iranians requires resisting both of these forms of reduction, or it would not be solidarity with the people of Iran, at least, at all. I'll stop here.
Thank you so much, Ladam. And I think we can really appreciate also how you're emphasizing that you also, from the perspective of someone in the Iranian diaspora, not knowing what the Iranian people want. Meanwhile, a lot of the left jumps into the vacuum and almost speaks as if it knew what Iranian people wanted while being very remote from them. That's a really also palpable contrast that we're picking up on. So next we will have Robin Yasin Kassab, who is a writer of both fiction and non-fiction. His latest book will be published in June. It's called The Blood Between Us, Syria After the Fall of Assad. He is English language editor of the Prisons Museum, a project documenting crimes committed in the prisons of both the Assad regime and ISIS. He writes essays for and helps edit Critical Muslim, a quarterly journal published by Hearst, and we're also very glad to have Robin with us in one of our featured panels at the Ruta conference in Ukraine last year, sharing about his work with the Prisons Museum. So very glad to have you with us again, and glad to hear you talk. Just unmute yourself.
I'm muting myself. I forgot. Thank you very much, Teresa, and thank you, Grazina, and thank you, Rafael and Ladan. It's really interesting, as ever, to see the parallels. So many things that both of you said ring true for the Syrian situation. This is an unfortunate habit of mind which is corrupting the left in particular and so-called progressive politics that we really need to do something about, because it's not just one struggle that it's affecting, but it's everything. It's everywhere. Let me start by going back to December 2024, when the Assad regime had just fallen to rebel forces. This was a real surprise, even for people like me who were fairly closely following Syria. We didn't expect it to happen. We knew that Russia was weaker because of Ukraine. We knew that Hezbollah and Iran were weaker because of a war with Israel. We knew that ISIS had been defeated. We knew that the Assad regime's economy had collapsed. But still, we thought that things weren't really going to improve. And a lot of us had kind of given up. And then suddenly, the Assad regime collapsed in 11 days. And in the middle of this process, I had stopped sleeping, like Syrians everywhere in the world. We'd stopped sleeping. We were just watching the news. We were experiencing all kinds of emotions. I was very, very happy. I was amazed and very happy, like most Syrians. And I went to a film showing, a Palestinian film was showing in our nearest big town. I live in Scotland. And I had been asked to be on a panel after the film and answer questions about the film and about the situation in Palestine. And I met the lady that organized the film, who is a progressive, pro-Palestine, very good person, a left-wing progressive person. And she said to me, "Oh, I'm so sorry to hear what's happening in Syria. It's terrible. I'm so sorry for you." And I said, what do you mean? This is the best thing that's happened in 14 years. I'm euphoric about what's happening in Syria. Now, what a strange response, because, okay, it's true. It was disturbing that an Islamist militia, an authoritarian Islamist militia, was taking over cities in Syria. If you take that by itself, that was disturbing. But look at the context. This is a situation, what the regime which was collapsing is one of the worst fascist regimes in all of history. It had murdered hundreds of thousands of people. It had destroyed the cities of Syria. It had destroyed the economy and the infrastructure. It had expelled 14 million people. Well over half the population had been expelled from their homes by this regime. It was a foreign occupation as well. The regime, since 2013, the regime had depended on Iran and Iranian transnational militias from Lebanon and Iraq and Afghanistan and Pakistan. And from 2015, that wasn't enough. It was also dependent on Russia bombing the cities in order to keep in power. So when you look at it like that, actually, what was happening was wonderful, but progressive leftist people in the West thought it was terrible. Why? Well, this goes back to the beginning of the revolution in 2011, and it intensified as time went on. People didn't know anything about Syria. Most people in the West couldn't really find Syria on the map, but they knew that it was an Arab country like Iraq. And they knew that in 2003, America had invaded Iraq because it wanted to do a regime change for its own reasons. So they assumed this must be the same thing. We don't need to actually study Syria. We don't need to talk to Syrians. We just know already, because I'm an anti-imperialist, so therefore I've got one model which I applied to Iraq, and I can apply it to everywhere else in the world without knowing anything about everywhere else in the world. So that's what they did. They assumed that it was a US-Israeli regime change plot. Now, it's true that President Obama at the time and Hillary Clinton, a few times they said that Assad is bad and Assad should go. But then if you actually look at what they didn't do anything at all to get rid of Assad. In fact, quite the opposite. Obama did a deal with Iran, which may have been a good idea he did a nuclear deal. It may have been a good idea, the nuclear deal, probably better than what Trump is doing now. But he didn't make a condition of the deal that Iran stops pouring troops and money into Syria and creating a bloodbath in Syria and a refugee problem. He didn't care about that. In fact, he said he was willing to recognize Iranian equities, as he called them, in Syria. They didn't put sanctions on Russia when Russia got involved in Syria and started bombing civilian targets in Syrian cities. They didn't put any extra sanctions on Russia. They were happy about that. In fact, Europe built another pipeline while that was going on to bring more Russian gas to Europe. So Obama sent CIA men to the Syrian border with Turkey to make sure that no other state was delivering heavy weapons or serious weapons to the rebels. So it was not a regime change from outside. But the leftists didn't make any analysis of social or economic or political conditions in Syria. They just didn't seem to be interested. They didn't listen to Syrian voices. Then there were lots of leftist and progressive Syrians involved in human rights and in political organizing who they could have asked. They weren't just Islamists, but they ignored them. They didn't want to hear from them. In fact, in some cases, they actually closed them down. I mean, I remember when Diane Abbott, who was a left-wing Labour Party MP in Britain, she held a meeting about Syria in the Houses of Parliament in Britain. And when Syrians attended the meeting and said, wait a minute, can we speak? She called the police and had them removed. That's how much they wanted to listen to Syrian voices. So you ended up with this situation, which is very similar to what Ladan has just said, a situation in which the Syrian people were assumed to have no agency whatsoever. They were just stupid children who somehow had been told by the Americans and the Israelis to go out and protest. I don't know how the Americans and the Israelis managed to get in touch with these Syrian people, but somehow they did. The Syrians were happy to have their children tortured to death and to be shot at and to have no money. They were happy about that because that's probably part of their culture to have their children tortured, until the Americans told them to go and protest about it. And then when they did, they were prepared to go and risk their lives and be shot at for the sake of the Americans and the Israelis. It really makes no sense at all, and it's really quite racist, but that's what people ended up believing. Where does all of this come from, really? I mean, it comes from a binarism, a binary habit of seeing opposites, good on one side, evil on the other, without any nuance. And I think this is bigger than just a problem in leftist politics or rightist politics. I think this is a human problem. It's to do with the structure of our minds, and it's to do with narrative. You know, if we look at Hollywood films or we look at fairy tales, we often have a character who is absolutely good fighting a character who is absolutely bad. And we like to understand the world in that way. And it's always a disaster when we apply this narrative structure to reality, any kind of reality. But when we apply it to states and to politics, it's really a disaster, because then we end up thinking, well, America and Israel are bad. I've worked that out. I'm an anti-imperialist. I know that America is bad. So therefore, Russia and Iran and President Assad and Maduro are good. And no, that's not how the world works. Just because America and Israel is bad, that doesn't make, Khamenei and Assad good. It really doesn't. It's much more complicated than that. Okay, because people started off from this binary position, they believed Russian and Iranian propaganda. And in the West, the main vectors for this propaganda were RT, the television Russia Today TV station, and Press TV, which is an Iranian TV station. And then, of course, they had lots of useful idiots, to use that phrase again, lots of useful idiots in the West, people like Corbyn and others, who some of them may have been good on domestic politics, but when it came to foreign politics, they were campists. They stood in one camp and they had this binary approach to the world. So therefore, they believed and relayed the propaganda that was coming from the Kremlin and from Iran and from Assad. What was this propaganda? Well, some of it was straightforward, that Assad is innocent of the atrocities that people are accusing him of. So they would rip up all the evidence and they would say he isn't killing people with sarin gas, for example. The sarin gas attack was done by the rebels themselves, or it was done by Turkey, or it was done by France, or it didn't actually happen. And they would throw out these stories. I remember the Russian Russian delegate or ambassador to the United Nations made a speech about the sarin gas attack, in which, or it may have been actually one of the chlorine gas attacks, in which, in the same speech, he said that it didn't happen and that it did happen, but that the rebels did it themselves. And it didn't worry the people that lapped this up, that believed the propaganda. It didn't worry them that in the same speech there was a contradiction, because they already wanted to believe something that absolved Assad of belief. And the Russian idea was not to have a coherent propaganda line. It was just to throw out so many stories that it would confuse people, and that people thought, well, we don't know what's going on, it's too complicated, so therefore we can't show any solidarity with the Syrian people. And then it went on more than that. There were, also leftists who in the previous decade, during the American invasion of Iraq and Afghanistan, they had opposed war on terror rhetoric. They were saying that you can't justify wars and understand world politics and the struggles within nations according to just this discourse about terrorism. Terrorism is bad, but it's much more complicated than that. Yet when it came to Syria, a lot of the same people started saying, oh, President Assad is fighting terrorists. And he wrote off the majority of the Syrian population, therefore, as all being terrorists. Or they said it's a fight of secularists versus Islamists. Because President Assad didn't have a beard and because his wife didn't wear a hijab, therefore he was secular, even though he was absolutely dependent on foreign jihadi Shia rather than Sunni jihadi militias to keep in power, even though they were using sectarianism as a key strategy for staying in power. Even though many of the people in the opposition were not Islamists, a lot of them were not even Muslims. There were also democratic local councils and theatre groups and all kinds of things which had nothing to do with religion. And they said it's a Sunni-Shia conflict which goes back thousands and thousands of years. It's true that an element of it did become, in some ways, a Sunni-Shia conflict. But that happened because of the political decisions that were made first by Assad and Iran, and then by groups like ISIS. And because the state shattered during the war, so people retreated in some cases into subnational identities. But that's not what it was really about. That's not how it started, and that doesn't explain it. The explanatory power of this doesn't work. It's just really Orientalism. Speaking of which, I remember a woman in Scotland asking me, she said, she saw I had a badge. She said, is that the Palestinian flag? And I said, no, it's the Free Syrian flag. And she went, oh, okay. So you think President Assad kills people? I said, well, yes, I know that President Assad kills people. And she said, But why would he hurt his own brothers and sisters? Now, again, this was a progressive left-wing Scottish woman who doesn't for a moment believe that the British Prime Minister thinks of her as his sister. She knows that they're on opposite sides, and yet she has this weird Orientalist view that good regimes like Bashar al-Assad's regime, he's a nice guy who loves his nice brown brothers and sisters. Anyway, so it's what all of this means that at the end of the day, tragically, the left in the West did even more than the right and the far right, who also did their bit, to make solidarity with revolutionary Syrians impossible. And that's a tragedy for people like us and for many people in Syria who had also assumed that there is a big section of the population in the West which will sympathize with us, which will recognize that we're struggling for democracy and for basic human rights and for social justice. And there are people in the West who believe in those things and they will stand with us. And those people didn't because of this binary problem. Finally, very quickly, I'm probably over my time, I am. Finally, very, very quickly, today, even today, when I talk in public in the West, I often find myself having to defend the new Syrian government. And I would really rather not do that. I would really rather spend my time on constructive criticism, because although they are better than they could have been as an Islamist militia that has taken over, they're still very problematic. There's a lot wrong with them. And yet you can't begin to arrive at the point where you're talking about that, because people say things like, why has Jolani given the Golan Heights to Israel and normalized with Israel? He hasn't. He just hasn't. Israel is bombing Syria every day. That's not normalization. It's just a fantasy world that they're living in. Why did America put ISIS in power? Well, America didn't put anybody in power, and it isn't ISIS. The people in power are at war with ISIS. At this point, because my time is up, I should shut up, except to say that there are so many parallels with other struggles around the world that these problems are not just Syrian or Iranian or Venezuelan or Ukrainian. They affect all of us. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Robin. This was, also very cathartic. I was listening to it and it just I could identify so much in the last 3 years also for us who grew up under Soviet military occupations and seeing the Russian invasion of Ukraine and thinking that someone in the Western left would understand something. So that was really, really relatable. And I think that now we have Maria who will also relate herself to this very much. Tragically, but we can learn from these things and also build wider solidarities. So Maria Vorotilina, it's very great to have you with us. You are a regular Ruta presenter at our conferences. She is a curator and activist from Zhytomyr in Ukraine, currently based between Berlin and Chemnitz. Her work focuses on translocal grassroots solidarities in complex political contexts. She engages with visual arts through queer, feminist, and decolonial lenses. Maria is interested in exploring Eastern Europe as an invented concept and critically examining the Western gaze on this region. So we're very glad to have you. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Teresa. Thank you very much for having me. And also, I'm really, really grateful to the contributors before, to Raphael, to Ladan, also to Robin and to Kazina. And of course, I could relate to many, many, many points that were mentioned. There was also kind of a lot of anger in me coming up because of that, because, the struggles are real. And what Robin said at the end, actually, they're not only related to our contexts, but across the globe. And it's very valuable for me now to have this space also and a possibility to talk about it, but also look beyond it and see how can we create solidarities and connections also despite this very complex political situations we are talking about. And as Teresa said, I was born and raised in Zhytomyr, which is the northern west of Ukraine. And since 2018, I live in Germany and I work here. And when the full-scale war of Russia against Ukraine started, I was in Germany, in Hamburg. And back then I was working in the cultural institution, like quite a big cultural institution. It's left institution, and people I was working with, but also many people we were working with. And as an institution, I was sharing many values together with. And when the full scale war started, it appeared to me all of a sudden that actually people that I shared so many values with before became alien to me in some way, because they didn't recognize Russia as imperialist state. Not everyone, but many of them didn't recognize Russia as imperialist state. They would drop some phrases like, you know, that Russia is defending itself from the NATO expansion. And therefore the environment that used to be very, very near to me became very actually kind of isolating. And there were the moments I remember I wanted to start this from a personal story, actually, because I really liked Robin, as you also started with this personal story, how you encountered a person who told you that she's very sorry, you know, for what is happening in Syria. And I was sitting at the lunch break, and at that time I used to take lunch breaks alone because I actually was afraid of the small talks, but also again of encountering some campist ideologies there, you know, like, and trying to defend Ukrainian resistance in Ukraine and explain the context. So I was sitting alone there, like during the lunch break, and crying. And then a colleague of mine from Syria came to me, and he fled Syria in 2015 from the Syria under the regime of Assad. And he came to me and he said, Maria, I feel with you. They will never understand you, but I feel with you. And this was somehow like this moment stayed with me so strongly because he knew exactly what I was talking about. And then we exchanged a lot on that because he said that when he fled to Germany, then people in Germany would tell him actually that Assad regime was not so bad, and it was not a problem that, you know, that Russia was supporting the regime of Assad. They would see it also as a kind of like anti-imperial decolonial force. And therefore, you know, we connected on that ground and exchange a lot. And that's where I felt that actually our contexts, even though they're geographically far away, but on the emotional level and on level of understanding certain things, we can connect much more than I would connect with some people who would actually call themselves left. And yeah, at that point, also in Germany, there were many letters that were appearing everywhere, like to their governments, or letters of intellectuals that would deny Ukrainian right to resist. And also from many associations, there were different statements that were circulating around the internet also regarding that. And of course, everything was going into the direction that there is the only imperial force existing in the world, and this is the West. And you know, because of the West expansion, the NATO expansion, Russia has to defend itself as a state, and Ukraine doesn't have a right to resist, basically, in this way. And yeah, which completely also disregards Russian imperialism and its influence not only in Eastern Europe, Central Asia, South Caucasus, but also extermination of indigenous populations and Russian influence all over the globe. You know, it's not only certain regions that we are talking about, but we know Russian influence also through the military forces in different parts of the globe, and not only, for example, in Ukraine. And which brought me actually to the, you know, something that immediately came to my mind in this regard was a letter to the Western left from Kyiv that was written by Ukrainian historian and socialist Taras Belous, who at the beginning of the full-scale invasion of Russia in Ukraine joined the armed forces of Ukraine. And then he wrote like a letter to his fellows who were also denying kind of his decision to join the Ukrainian armed forces. And here I would like to cite some parts of this letter. Yesterday, I spent half the day considering whether I ought to join Territorial Defense Unit. During the night that followed, the Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky signed a full mobilization order, and Russian troops moved in and prepared to encircle Kyiv, which made the decision for me. But before taking my post, I would like to communicate to the Western left that what I think about its reaction to Russia's aggression against Ukraine. And first, he thanks to his comrades who actually supported Ukrainian resistance and who criticized and who understood actually the background of Russian invasion. But then he says, this article is about the other part of the Western left, those who imagined NATO aggression in Ukraine and who could not see Russian aggression, or the DSA International Committee, which published a shameful statement failing to say a single critical word against Russia, or those who criticized Ukraine for not implementing the Minsk agreements and kept silent about their violations by Russia and the so-called People's Republics, or those who exaggerated the influence of the far right in Ukraine but did not notice the far right in the People's Republics and avoided criticizing Putin's conservative, nationalist, and authoritarian policy. This is a part of the wider phenomenon in the Western anti-war movement, usually called Campism, by critics on the left. British Syrian author and activist Leila Al-Shami gave it a stronger name, the anti-imperialism of idiots. And very often also in the feminist circles, at the beginning of the full-scale invasion, there were also open letters of feminists who were denying the right of the Ukrainian society to resist Russian invasion. And there were manifests that were written and signed by hundreds of feminists across the globe. And therefore, there was also a response written by Ukrainian feminists who wrote it in March 2022 and published on the online magazine Commons, where they write, "We feminists from Ukraine call on feminists around the world to stand in solidarity with the resistance movement of the Ukrainian people against the predatory imperialist war unleashed by the Russian Federation. War narratives often portray women as victims. However, in reality, women also play a key role in resistance movements, both at the front line and on the home front, from Algeria to Vietnam, from Syria to Palestine, from Kurdistan to Ukraine." And this is also something what I find very powerful from written by Ukrainian feminists on the ground at the moment of the life-threatening events to them, also thinking about the solidarity with global resistances and mentioning other contexts that are resisting as well and connecting broader contexts of resistance against the imperialism. And also another danger that I wanted to talk about that campist ideology perpetuates is actually perpetuation of the Russian propaganda. And this is something that is very important because Russia uses actively the propaganda in Latin America, in Asia, in African continent, in Middle East, but also targeting the left communities all across the world, and also portraying itself as a decolonial ally. And it's really interesting that then the campist ideology, it actually takes the Russian propaganda and spread it further. And recently, for example, I watched the keynote of the Nigerian journalist Philip Obaji, and he writes about the African continent. Back in Africa, Russia has not only changed military landscape, it's also changed informational landscape in parts of the continent. These informational campaigns flooded social media. Narrative portraying Russia as Africa's liberator circulated widely online. Journalists like me who investigate Russian activities faced intimidation, harassment, and the goal is simple: to control the narrative. And when the narrative is controlled, accountability disappears. And this is something what struck me really much when he said about the accountability, and that accountability disappears. And this is often what we see actually when people disregard Russian imperialism, when people disregard the imperialist aggression of Russia in Ukraine, because then comes a question: who will be accountable afterwards? who will hold Russia accountable for the crimes. And when we disregard the invasion, when we call it a defense against NATO, then it means that there will be no one accountable for it. And this is important for me. And I wanted actually maybe to talk about another aspect that is very important for me, because I was thinking a lot like how I work with it, or how I work in my communities with also the campist positions, and how I try to maybe face them or counter them. And I realized that for me, actually, campist positions, they lack a lot the feminist perception of the world. And for me, a feminist perception of the world is actually something based on empathy and something based on love. And empathy is something that actually campism lacks a lot. And I was recently reading an article of the Argentinian scholar Maria Lugones, who wrote about the world traveling and how we can understand others better. And she said, like, to travel to the world of others means to actually try to really understand experiences of others. It's not to go to the worlds and conquer them in a way, but actually really, really put an effort to understand others. And this is something where I think, then it means to actually look at what people on the ground want, look at what people on the ground need, and hear them and listen to them. And I was thinking a lot on about the fact that I actually stopped trying to convince people, and it like stopped at some point to try to talk to them and convince people who have really, really strong ideological background or views. But what I do now instead, I try actually to focus on building solidarity with other movements. That would actually, the idea of this solidarity and connection would shake the ground of the campist worldview, because they would not see these movements as those standing in solidarity. And this is something very important for me. And here I would like maybe to bring an example of the also Ukrainian letter of solidarity with people of Palestine. Now, this is something that does not fit the ideology of campism at all. And this is something that is important because it shakes the core ground of it. And maybe as the end, I would like to come back to this phrase of my colleague from Syria who told me that, I feel with you. And for me, actually, this I feel with you has a lot to do with empathy, what I said before. And empathy means like not to look down at someone and pity someone, but it actually means to feel the rage, to feel the anger, to feel love, to feel grief with people, with the communities. And this is something where I think there can we find the ground for solidarity and connection. And it means actually to question then the worldview we have all the time as a lifelong process, and try to fill the gaps with the knowledge, or like to rethink the knowledge, to unlearn what we have learned before. And I would like to, for those maybe who are in Berlin on the May 16th, I would like to invite also to join our program that is called So Far So Near, Entangled Solidarity's Fragile Connections, and it's going to take place at the Spore Initiative. And I'm really happy because Robin is going to participate in the discussion, and also Philip Obagi, who I mentioned before, is going to be there at the conversation. And there we will also try to build solidarities between the contexts that are quite often portrayed as opposing each other, and try to find the common ground for connection rather than for the disconnection. Thank you.
Thank you, Maria. And I really appreciate also what you were saying about this Syrian colleague, because the I feel with you is such a constructive way of approaching this as well, rather than, for example, thinking that one knows what you feel, is feeling with you and maybe trying to understand, how the intersections of that, because it also seems that a lot of time there are these attempts at empathy, but they involve projections, right? Projections from positions that actually do not know what people feel in these situations. And I think Ladan's talk spoke to that really well, as well, the issues that can happen. And so when I was listening to all of you, what comes out of this is really each of you is speaking in one way or another about trying to communicate something to a segment of global left that doesn't want to hear, right? And all of you are basically saying that there is a lack of listening and that listening is needed. And I wonder, how do we navigate this? How do we go forward? Because we know that solidarities are needed, right? But how do we go about it? Do we build, and we definitely need to build these wider solidarities among, different struggles where we actually do hear one another and when we can relate to one another. But I'm also thinking, is there a point, and how do we do it? Trying to speak to the left that does not want to hear. Because, for example, so Maria, you mentioned the letter about Ukrainian letter of solidarity with Palestinian people. I am in discussions where we constantly remind people that this was written, but it's almost as if it wasn't, because it just doesn't fall into those kind of binaries that are ready to hear or see the existence or engage with this, right? And so it's constantly still this kind of parallel worlds that do not want to cross the kind of boundary a lot of the time. So how do we, is there a way of, trying to somehow intervene into this kind of binary thinking that does not want to listen and hear? Are there any strategies that worked for you that you've seen working that made a change or shift? Or should we put more energy into just focusing on the solidarities we can have with one another and bypassing the campist left altogether, because there's no point?
Well,
Yes, Robin.
Yes. Well, I think first, most people, and this is not an insult to most people involved in leftist politics are following other people. For example, they believe that Jeremy Corbyn is a good guy because he's said good things about workers' rights in Britain and he says good things about Palestine. So I trust Jeremy Corbyn. So he's on press TV telling me that Ukraine is a proxy war and that Syria is a proxy war and so on. So I trust him. Now, that's very, very depressing, but it does suggest that if we can somehow have an effect and get a critical mass of leaders thinking differently about this, then the followers will follow. So I think that the work that we're doing in this kind of, the work that Ruta is doing and other organizations trying to build this kind of solidarity is really, really important. We don't know the effects that it will have until we see the effects. So that's the first thing. And quickly, Leila Ashami, who was mentioned by Maria, who wrote The Anti-Imperialism of Idiots, I know that she's working in an organization called the People's Want, People's Plural. If you look that up online, you'll see that they're trying to do precisely this. They're trying to link up people from Sudan and Ukraine and Venezuela and Mexico and Chile and lots of different struggles in order to create this, what they call internationalism from below. That's called the People's Plural Want. And then finally, quickly, the role of culture. Maria, again, made a very important point about empathy. I think that's so important that the root of our politics shouldn't be ideology. It shouldn't be binaries. It should always be human empathy. And culture helps. I noticed that when we were working on Syria, I did a tour with a book called Syria Speaks, which was arts and literature from Syria, and you could get through to people who you couldn't get through to with a political discourse because they'd already made up their mind, they already had their worldview and the people that they listened to, and they weren't going to listen to you. But if you showed them a film or read them part of a novel or a poem, suddenly they would, or showed them a picture, some artwork, suddenly it would get through to them on a human level. These are human beings. These are people who are actually quite like me. And of course, I wouldn't want to be tortured. And then immediately, I wouldn't want my country to be invaded and a foreign army to come to my house and threaten to kill me. And, so there we go. Culture and solidarity and the work that we are doing to try and influence progressive politics is really important.
Thank you. I saw Ladan had her.
Yes. So I want to also actually maybe add a hopeful note to all of this, because I do feel like I have been able to have really productive conversations with people about Iran. And I want to say, so, my talk was also about different extremes, the right and the left. And something that really divides those two for me is that I cannot have those productive conversations with the right. I've tried, I fail always. I have had examples of productive conversations with the campus left. And it is because, and I don't want to disregard the possibility of a lack of empathy among that group in the way that Maria was talking about, but I've also seen almost too much empathy because of the world that we're living in, because the monsters of our time are so big, because we have the genocidal US policies and Israeli genocides happening in Lebanon and Palestine. And then there is this anger, there's this ingrained anger, which then translates into, plus coupled with a lack of knowledge or context about what is happening, for instance, in Syria or in Iran. Then that is coupled with that anger, which then transforms everything that is against those monsters as a force of good, right? So to make a coherent kind of understanding of what is happening in this context possible is not very easy for everybody. For someone who has not been in that context, doesn't have access to information, historical background, people, frankly, or happens to Robin was talking about press TVs and RTs in this world, right? So TRT, the Turkish TV. So these are actually, this propaganda works on Westerners too. We have propaganda in the West as well. I tell Germans, you have been exposed to German pro-Israeli propaganda all your life. And they're shocked because I'm using the term propaganda in a European context. It functions in the same way. So those propaganda are also present. So I feel like by contextualizing, by being able to, and of course this is a difficult thing, right? Because you need the time, you need the space, you need the willingness, you need to have, people whose work is this to kind of contextualize things and produce information about things that they may not know about. And if you can produce that space, I feel like there is a possibility. And what I have done, and maybe kind of using the kind of the notion of empathy here a little bit, to tap into the kind of empathy that they do know, that they can feel. So if there is this segment of campists who can have empathy with Palestine, who do understand that struggle, right, in its complexity, not to glorify Hamas, but also understand and explain why it exists. If you can, then couple that with information about Iran and about Syria and so on, and Lebanon as well, right? It's such a difficult context. It's really difficult, even for people born there, living there. It's difficult to grasp. So I feel like if those kinds of couplings works, things that Maria was talking about, actually really doing this kind of, solidarity events, bringing in conversation people who are from different contexts, but are actually experiencing the same shapes of politics. That has been successful in my case to some extent. Of course, my means are also limited, right? So this has to be put to test in other contexts. And I think maybe I'll leave it at this. That I find that it is more than just unwillingness. It is more than just politics. It is also a systematic lack of understanding, and this is historically built through Western education. Like they don't read, they don't learn about our histories, they don't learn about our cultures, about our politics, and that really does translate into ignorant subjects which have to be trained and taught to think critically about the other places in the world.
Yeah, thank you so much for saying that, because I think one of the issue also when I'm looking at thinking of Western curriculums, right, the lack of reading, it's almost translates into this assumption that voices from our struggles do not exist, or we don't know what's happening and we need to be explained what really is happening in our own histories, right? We're not capable of like understanding them ourselves. So I can, for example, see that like when you want to I so often come across leftists who just, when we try to speak about from Europe's East, that they tell us we just need to read more Marx to really understand what's happening to us, which is so colonial in so many ways. It's almost tragicomic, but it's not seen as such, right? And what you were
Yeah.
saying about the anger, I find really important, because what I've also noticed in the last 3 years plus is how anger at what Israel is doing to Gaza and Palestinians gets taken out on Ukrainians who are being invaded and genocided by Russia, right? And these are patterns of pain and anger and projection that really need to be disentangled and looked at and addressed and dealt with. And I'm still also trying to wrap my head around what exactly is going on so much, because the constant instrumentalization and binary thinking and contrasting of different people and pitting them against one another in a situation where this does harm to every side of those struggles is really counterproductive, and the left should not be wanting to be part of this, right? If it wants to do something with anti-oppression.
Yeah.
I wanted
And
to
if I
ask, yeah,
may add
yes,
one tragedy comedy to what you were saying.
yeah,
After the U.S.-Israeli attacks on Iran, they attacked a volleyball school. So there were basically schoolgirls going to volleyball classes, and they killed them. And I saw online people posting about how they had absolutely no idea that Iranian girls also played volleyball. So this is the kind of the level of the depth of ignorance. And going back to Robin was saying about how kind of caricatures are created of what the Oriental subjects looks like. Actually, I said Oriental. It's almost we're like stuck at the kind of 18th century whatever Orientalist views of the East, right? So we are either the barbarians or savages. To draw on Said. Said also sees Orientalism as this kind of two-way thing. It's not just one way. One of it is that the Oriental subject is seen as a barbarian or a savage, and the other one glorifies it. It sees as hypersexual. It sees it as esoteric, and we have the savages and barbarians imagery on the right, and then we have this glorified imagery on the left. So we're kind of stuck within the same problematic discourses.
I think we also have a response from Rafael, right? Feel free to jump in. Was there a message in the chat from Rafael? Okay.
Yes. So Rafael put in a message, but I think we would need some help with translation. I don't feel
Okay. If you can
quite,
put it in the wider
yes.
chat so that Sheila can help us. Okay.
Okay.
And maybe before we get there, I'll just ask one more
Yes.
question, and I will try to integrate also questions in the chat, because do we have Ladan? Or did she have to run away for a second? Okay. I wanted to maybe put this to Maria then with Ladan, because there were these manifestos that you, Maria, mentioned, right? And what I found striking in 2022, both Iranian and Ukrainian feminists wrote manifestos. And what I found most striking was how similar that ethos was, right? Both Ukrainian and Iranian feminists were basically saying to global feminists that they're not listening, and that they have very orientalizing approaches to women in these different contexts. And they do these kind of binary sort of, again, frames where in Iran they're orientalizing, but then also unwilling to listen to Iranian feminist critiques of the Islamic regime. And in Ukraine, you mentioned the Right to Resist manifesto that basically responded to the Russian invasion, but also feminist so-called anti-war manifestos that were framed as solidarity, but they absolutely misunderstood the context, and they didn't basically consult Ukrainian feminists in writing manifestos that were posited as solidarity with Ukraine. So how can you do solidarity with Ukraine if you are not listening to what Ukrainian feminists know, say, want? And so they also ended up doing harm, right? Because they basically argued for not supporting Ukrainian self-defense, which some of us then argued is really absurd because that should be the utmost pillar of feminism, that women have the right to defend themselves against invasion that involves every Russian invasion involved the systemic use of sexualized violence and rape against women. So that was absolute shocking case of harm in these global feminist communities. And I wanted to ask you, have you seen since that time some kind of shifts within the feminist movements that so often posited themselves as really capable of analyzing abuse of power, and yet they themselves abuse power? Did you see any shifts or at least critical self-reflections on the misconceptions that have and the abuse of power that has been done, or do you have some meaningful discussions around this with the more international feminist movements? Ladan or Maria, do hop in, and we just ask Sheila if she can have a look at the contribution that's been posted into the chat by Rafael, so we can get some translation.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, I think I can translate it on the spot if that's simple enough.
Fantastic.
But
so
after Ladan.
And there is also a question, Ladan, to you in the chat, just asking how currently are women basically active in the anti-regime protests. Thank you.
I can maybe answer both actually in one go. They are quite related to each other.
Yes.
Yeah. So there was a letter. I think that the letter was addressed to academics. So a letter to feminist academics. And I have to say, and this is coming from a very kind of privileged position in my specific location in Amsterdam, at the University of Amsterdam. I had a really good experience. I gave numerous talks in the Netherlands and in Belgium, which were really well received. And to my understanding, they were not, going after simplistic ideas. However, outside the academy, I have to say that it was really like this. So it was quite an overwhelming amount of attention given to the woman life freedom, although it got really tremendous amount of attention worldwide. But when it came to feminist circles, and especially, well-known left circles or activist groups, there was not quite a lot. And that is because of this, this weird flaw and Eurocentric view that associates the veil with anti-imperialism and somehow romanticizes it. And this is a really interesting thing because in so many ways it goes against everything that feminism has been trying to fight for decades, basically. So essentialization. Imagine the whole feminist gender movement has been built around this idea that gender should not be essentialized, and no notions should be essentialized in a way. But the veil is somehow seen as a form of resistance everywhere, not only in the context of the West. And of course, it does translate in Western context in a lot of cases as a form of resistance. And in that sense, it should be seen like that, and it should be celebrated, and it should be connected to women's right to their bodily integrity. But then to take that and try and apply that lens in the Iranian context, and through that lens translate what is happening inside Iran, this massive feminist uprising in Iran, a women-led pluralistic intersectional movement into we're not sure if this aligns with our politics, is such a Eurocentric thing to do. So yes, indeed, it happened. And again, it was part of the good fight that I tried to fight, to try and kind of complicate the picture as much as I could. Now, this brings me to a rather, actually, I would say, kind of maybe a sad or pessimistic view on what is happening around women life freedom and its continuation at the moment, because it was a beautiful moment. And to be honest, I had naively imagined that the woman life freedom ethos, that kind of pluralistic progressive ethos, continuing forever. I thought, okay, this is going to be the resistance in Iran, and it was so invigorating. But then the protests happened at the beginning of this year, and I mean, I gave an overview of all kinds of manipulations that happened afterwards. Most unfortunately, the voices of Iranian people were shut down, still are, right? So we're still in communication blackout in Iran. We don't know. So for your question, if I have to answer it in an empirical way, it is very difficult for me to know, and I think for everybody to know what is exactly happening inside Iran. But what I saw from diasporic activism and social media activism, and I have to say, Women Life Freedom is a grassroots people-led movement, right? So what is happening online is Women Life Freedom. So it is not like it has a center where the decisions are made. No, it is carried out by people. There has been a shift, unfortunately, in Iran. And that has been because of the way, as I explained, the factions that have kind of become empowered after the 2026 protests. And one of the results of this kind of fights between different factions and the massive empowerment of the monarchist faction has been that there is an anti-gender pushback against the woman life freedom movement, which is considered a leftist movement, which very much aligns with anti-war sentiments, whereas the monarchist faction has not always, but mostly aligned itself with pro-war and pro-Netanyahu and pro-America stances. And because they were the ones who got more empowered, and they're also, by the way, they're much better funded. So I'm talking about the monarchists here, much better funded, much better organized. And they have managed to kind of push themselves as a more united front in comparison with other groups, which are much more pluralistic, but at the same time really scattered. So I have to say, most sadly, we are a far cry away from that progressive movement that existed. Now, you asked about the role of women. The role of women has almost nothing to do with the woman life freedom movement. You can say, movement is progressive without necessarily having women at its head. And in fact, currently, both on both fronts, on the right front and on the left front, you have a lot of women activists. So women activists remain a very important and integral part of all kinds of resistance and movements inside Iran. When it comes to that progressive feminist ethos, unfortunately, that has been diminished because of diasporic politics and the current geopolitics, also exacerbated because of the Israeli-US attack on Iran. I hope I managed to answer everything in one go.
That was amazing. Thank you so much. Maria, I will ask you to respond. And when you're responding, there's another question in chat that I think really links to this. And it's asking about the kind of interaction of campism and pacifism, because we see these kind of out of touch abstract pacifist debates, and they very much fed into the so-called anti-war feminist manifestos. So I think you will have a lot to say on that too.
Yeah, thank you, Teresa. Actually, when you asked the question, I was a bit puzzled about it, to be honest, because I must say that the attention to Ukraine decreased significantly from the time of the beginning of the full-scale war until now, and it's for me really, really difficult to trace whether something has really drastically changed, because there is very little talk about Ukraine generally in the feminist circles. And there are sporadic events, and here I must have, of course, like I put the disclaimer, of course, Ukraine gets attention, and in comparison to other contexts like Sudan that never gets attention, it still gets some attention. But I must say that in comparison to how much attention it got at the beginning of the full-scale war, much of it was very, very performative, and people kind of felt like they need to say something. Now, when things become much more complex, there is very little people who say something. So there was, of course, like no other letter writing an apology to Ukrainian feminists, and actually saying, yeah, we support your right to resist, and we demand that you receive all of the means necessary to resist. So this is something that has not really, really happened. What happened in Ukraine also, that feminists have so much work to do. It's not, I mean, there is, to be honest, very little space to also like write letters, endless letters to kind of explain the positioning, because first of all, people resist the Russian invasion. People lose their loved ones daily. People lose their comrades. People lose their friends daily. And then on top of that, they also need to still work on the society that would be actually having democratic values, because this is the reason why people resist the Russian invasion. They don't want to live under fascist regime. So they need to do this daily work of like keeping the democracy, working on the human rights, even though it's complicated, like to have this fight ready on many, many fronts, because this is how it works. Unfortunately, you cannot postpone like human rights for after the war. And this is something what I see changing, because the society and the problems in society because of war, because of Russian invasion, become so complex and become so overwhelming that people just really don't have resources anymore to write letters to campists, to explain themselves, because there is just, fight happening on the ground that will not be fought by anyone else. And regarding what Ladan also said before, I also actually, not to be completely pessimist, I would also say that I have had really, really good conversations with people who really see the world in its complexities, and who can understand people on the ground, who hear the voices, who listen to the voices. And it gives a lot of hope, actually, that people working in different fields and working in different directions, activism, academia, arts, culture, in very various ways, they actually can, open the doors for others to look at things maybe differently, which is really, really important. And I really support that. And that's why I appreciate our work on different grounds and on different fronts. And regarding pacifism, yes, of course. I mean, for many feminists, and I mean, including me, I'm also against the global militarization. And this is the thing. And I think many people don't understand it. It's in Ukrainian context. If you are against Russian imperialism, you don't have to be necessarily pro-NATO. You don't have to say that NATO is great. And somehow this doesn't come to mind as like self-explanatory, that you can think you can stand against NATO. You can be against Russian imperialism. You can also be against militarization, but see at this point necessity for Ukrainian resistance. And this is somehow, I mean, this requires looking at complexities. This requires what I also think like something that falls out, like thinking of the things that fall out from the theoretical frameworks that we know. And this is also very, very uncomfortable for many people. And I understand that this is uncomfortable, but that's how, unfortunately, the world works. We cannot seek for comfort everywhere. We need to look at the discomfort there and actually learn how to live with it, learn how to live with the complexity.
Yeah, thanks so much. And I will reiterate that also a left that in so many other contexts, speaks about how important it is to unlearn and unsettle should also take its own advice and do that kind of work towards itself, because we haven't seen enough of it, right? To unsettle the kind of binary and simplistic frameworks that a lot of the campus left has worked with that is needed. So now Grażyna will read what Rafael wrote in the chat, but I will also first say that there's another question that Rafael might want to think about for a little bit in the chat that basically says that there is real dissonance, right, in a lot of discussions across Europe's East and Latin America, because it seems that, for example, in a lot of the leftist and decolonial Latin American movements, Russia has been not perceived as bad, maybe not completely good, but not that bad. And so how do we deal with this? How do we navigate it? And I will say that the next webinars that are coming will also be looking more closely into that across the kind of discussions with Ruta regions and Latin America. So we will be addressing this in great depth. So, stay tuned for what's coming. And Grażyna, please read out the comment from Rafael.
So on behalf of Rafael, I would like to contribute to the conversation that we must increase the political cost of the double standard by which a protester killed by a right-wing government is worth much more than a protester killed under a left-wing or anti-imperialist government. And this double standard is at the heart of campism. The struggles of the feminist movement over many decades managed to make gender-based violence to stop being considered normal. This is an example we can follow to increase the political cost of hypocrisy in politics. And then Rafael continues, when distance turns into authority and abstract principles become a disciplinary yardstick, solidarity ceases to be a bridge and instead becomes a mechanism of tutelage. In the face of this, the task is not to demand silence from intellectuals, nor to shield suffering from all criticism, but to restore a basic ethical hierarchy. In concrete conflicts, the first world, and also the last, cannot belong to those who observe from the outside, but to those who carry the weight of history on their own bodies.
Thank you so much. That's really powerful. And I will say that we're right now also revisiting some of the debates in Europe's East and the kind of legacy of suffering under authoritarian state socialist regimes. And what also often is striking is how much the campus left doesn't want to understand that, for example, some of the people who protested the state socialist regimes becoming increasingly authoritarian and totalitarian were the leftists. And those were the people who were imprisoned and who were sometimes also killed by those regimes. Those were leftist critics of state socialism. And this is something when we speak about it, always blows minds and kind of, again, sadly, very often ends up completely not understood because the left cannot hear this, cannot take this, that the left opposed totalitarian leftist regimes. And they were on the absolute front of that struggle. It wasn't often the right-wing capitalists who were protesting them. It was the left, because the left wanted democratic socialism, not undemocratic one. So I think maybe on this, we are coming out of, we're getting to the point of running out of time, but everyone in the chat reiterated how great this discussion was and how important it was. So from us, we can only wish that we will continue this, but also continue this under much better conditions, because first and foremost, we are in solidarity with the people who are struggling under the regimes that we're critiquing here now, and we hope that they will come to an end. Thank you so much for being here with us, and we will stay in touch.
Thank you.
Thank you for organizing. Thank you so much.
Thank you. I
Thank
learned
you,
very much.
everyone.
Bye.
Thank you to all of you. Thank you.
Everybody.
Bye.